I studied economics in college when I was young, and I learned there about a man named Ibn Khaldun, who lived 1,200 years ago in Egypt. And 1,200 years ago, he said, in the beginning of the empire, the rates were low, the tax rates were low, but the revenue was great. He said in the end of the empire, when the empire was collapsing, the rates were great and the revenue was low.
Good afternoon, everyone, especially the regular listeners of Khanversations. Today we have an exciting person that we are going to talk to. We are talking to Professor Stephen Dale, who is now retired from Ohio State University, but he was a prominent and is a prominent voice on the history of East Islamic world, especially the Muslim world on the eastern side, India particularly. But today we are going to talk to him about Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun is considered by many as a very prominent Muslim thinker, perhaps the most important Muslim scholar to have come out during the Golden Age. He's considered as the founder of the philosophy of history, or also the founder of sociology. His Ilm al-Umran, the science of civilization, is considered as a new discipline. And his approach was quite unique and different from traditional Muslim scholars. So he did garner a lot of attention, both in the Muslim world and in Europe and other places. So we will talk about Ibn Khaldun. The book that we will be focusing on primarily is actually an introduction to his book on history. This is the book that we will be talking about. It's Mukaddima by Ibn Khaldun. Mukaddima means a prologue or an introduction. But we will be talking about it in the context of Professor Dale's own book, which is a very interesting combination of both a discussion of Ibn Khaldun's ideas as well as the historical context in which he lived, and also his impact on European philosophy. The book is called The Orange Trees of Marrakesh. I will be posting a link to the book both in the video as well as below the video. For those of you who are interested, you can go ahead and get a copy. I would strongly recommend that you get a copy for it. And those of you who teach senior level seminars on Islamic thought or graduate seminars, this would be a good book to include in your courses. So Dr. Dale, thank you very much, and you're welcome to Khanversations.
Well, it's my pleasure.
The last time we met, it was on Istanbul airport. We were returning from Istanbul after attending an Ibn Khaldun symposium. So I want to start off right away by asking you the question, who was Ibn Khaldun? For those who have never heard of Ibn Khaldun, who was Ibn Khaldun?
Well, Ibn Khaldun was an individual from an elite Muslim family whose ancestors, most of whose ancestors had been prominent officials and scholars in Andalusia. He received an elite education, typical of many people of his class and status, in both the religious and philosophical sciences. And that education went on probably from the time he was 5 or 6 years old, the formal part of his education, until he was 20. And he was born in 1332. In 1348, both of his parents and a large number of the population in Tunis and in the Mediterranean died of the plague. In any case, when he was 20, he joined his first position in the state of Tunis, controlled by the Hafsid. It's a dynasty, one of the many dynasties in North Africa at this time, essentially as a calligrapher. And then through the rest of his life, he had various appointments in Tunis and in Fez, and then for a period of time in Granada, and then back to North Africa, and eventually the latter part of his life he spent in Egypt, where for various periods of his life in Egypt, he was the head Maliki Qadi in Egypt. And he was both in and out of power in that position, but in any case, the most famous work, the work which you're alluding to today, he wrote the initial draft of it in 1377 when he was living in the desert, off in the desert with a tribal group Biskra, which is in the interior part of North Africa. And then he revised part of this later on in Tunis and also in Egypt. But essentially, the core of the book was written in 1377. And the interesting thing about it, of course, is that it had a minimal impact on Islamic historiography, except for the Ottomans. That is to say, later on, the Ottomans picked up on this work for a variety of reasons. And the first translations of the book, or the first knowledge of the book in Europe, came from people who knew Turkish or knew Ottoman Turkish and began to introduce it to the West. But in Islamic historiography, that is to say, in the history of the Islamic world or among Muslim historians, especially those who were Arabists, it had actually very, very little impact. And I think the reason for that probably is that it's not an easy text, as we know, as you know, to read. It isn't a simple text to read. It's a very complex one, full of very difficult, complex arguments and philosophical allusions to, well, the use of philosophy to express his ideas.
So, you know, when people generally talk of Ibn Khaldun, they often refer to him as a diplomat scholar, but I mean, in modern terms, he would probably be the kind of person you would hire to be your national security advisor. And he,
yes, that's a good analogy. Yes,
yeah,
right.
so he probably was the national security advisor to many people. But to me, like coming to the book itself and his ideas, like what was distinctive? Like what was the rupture? What are the key elements of his scholarship in Mukaddima, which were so different from the traditional Islamic approach to writing history and scholarship? Like what was the new way, method, or ideas that Ibn Khaldun brought?
As you know yourself, I mean, what he claimed to be doing something very new. That is, he was very conscious of doing something original and remarkable. He says this several times in his book. And the principal claim rested on his critique of traditional Islamic historiography. That is, he said, the tradition of narrative historiography, when historians simply relate the history of a dynasty or of a people without any kind of critical interpretation, he said, is worthless. And what he was doing, he said, was to turn history into a philosophical science. He said that very clearly in the introduction to the Muqaddima. It's just unmistakable that what he was trying to do. And by turning into a philosophical science, he meant, I think, something very specific. That is to say, he intended to use the ideas and methodologies of Greco-Islamic thought, of Greco-Islamic philosophy. That is, the ideas which came originally from Greek philosophy, but which had been elaborated more by people like Asabiya and other Ibn Sina and such individuals, and particularly by Ibn Rushd in Andalusia. And the basis of his thought really comes out of Aristotelian thought, which was especially elaborated on by Ibn Rushd in Andalusia. And by his ideas, philosophical ideas and methodology, I mean, you can refer to two specific things as just beginning of the discussion. One, he said that historians should not try to have these worthless narrative histories, but look and try to establish or identify the nature or essence of the societies that they studied. Now, this idea about nature or essence comes out of a very early period in Greece, but which is elaborated on in Aristotelian thought. And secondly, so that's one of the principal ideas, to look for the sort of essential qualities of the societies that they're studying to be able to understand its history. And the second part of this, that is to say, the methodology, is, of course, the logical methodology of Aristotle and others, which were particularly elaborated by Al-Farabi. And so those two things, I think one can look to as the basis of what he was trying to do. That is to say, to completely resurrect history as a philosophical discipline. Now, in saying that, I don't mean to say that he was a philosopher, because I don't think you could say that he was a philosopher. What you can say is that he was doing what Durkheim did in Europe later on. That is to say, Durkheim, who was a sociologist, Durkheim says that the basis of his sociology was philosophy. And I think you can say the same thing about Ibn Khaldun. That is, Ibn Khaldun was doing which nobody in Europe did until 400 or 500 years later. That is, use philosophy to study social and political human affairs, particularly the society and politics. And so he applied ideas he found in Greco-Islamic philosophy, and did the same things that then Europeans did in the 18th and 19th and 20th century. People like Montesquieu or Durkheim, who use philosophy to create really the social sciences. And I think it's absolutely accurate to say that that what Ibn Khaldun did in the 14th century is a remarkably original, the first really creation essentially of a social science methodology. A kind of historical sociology, I guess, was the best description of what I think he did in his book.
I mean, Arnold Toynbee writes about Ibn Khaldun that this was perhaps the most remarkable, astonishingly original and brilliant work in history for a long time. I have a very specific question.
Mm-hmm.
Given Ibn Khaldun's affinity to philosophy and Greco-Islamic philosophy, when I was reading about his conception of the state, he argues that the ultimate goal of Asabiya is to establish a kingdom. But in his discussion of Al-Farabi's Madinatul Fadila, he just dismisses the idea of a virtuous republic as unrealistic and basically wishful thinking. And to me, that was quite interesting and sort of contradictory, because he seemed to advocate the methods of Farabi, but was not interested in the products of the methods of Farabi by Farabi himself.
I think one of the things, I mean, of course, he, as you know, a lot of his discussion revolves around the idea of the Sultanate.
Yes.
And first of all, I think, that when he's talking about his ideal state, he's not talking about the city that the Greeks talked about, but he's talking about the larger state.
Yeah.
And of course, the other thing I think one could say about him is he was pretty cynical, very cynical about this. I mean, when he talks about the Sultanate, he said the Sultanate is based upon power and money.
Yeah.
And so and when he discusses politics, I mean, he certainly bases his whole theory is this idea of Asabiya, and which is usually translated as group feeling. There's some kind of this feeling of kinship in a tribal situation, which then leads to these tribes overtaking the sedentary states in North Africa. But in terms of his descriptions of what goes on in these states, of course, I think it's quite a cynical or realistic. Perhaps the best description of it would be a realistic description of what happened. And I think, after all, if you read about his history in Tunis, particularly, but in Fez and in Granada, and then back in North Africa, and then in Egypt, where he became a Malik al-Qadi, that he had a very realistic appreciation of what was going on in these states. And so, as I say, his description of the Sultanate, which is what he describes as what was happening at the time he was writing, is one which he explicitly says these were states which were not based upon the Prophet Muhammad's original ideas or methods, but they're based upon power and money. So it's very clearly. And he often talks about how the original companions of the Prophet had kind of internalized the religious message of the Prophet and didn't really have to rely on text or any kind of interpretations of a law that people did later on. But he says by the time you get to the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, particularly, that most of that original spirit had been lost. And what you have in its place is the development of these sultanates. And that's, he says, what what he was looking at, of course, what he experienced in North Africa and Spain. And as you said, the analogy of him being a national security advisor, it had even greater dangers in the 14th century than it does now. Now people are simply fired. In the 14th century, they tended to be executed, such as Ibn al-Khatib, the famous vizier from Granada, who eventually
who was his best friend, actually, right? He's one
Pardon me?
He was Ibn Khaldun's one of supporters and best friends.
And best friends, although it's hard to, there apparently was professional jealousy in Granada. It's hard. Ibn Khaldun is known as someone who is very self-confident, is the nicest way of putting it.
Others called him opportunist.
Yes, he was. I usually describe him, to use a phrase that's used in Chinese historiography, as a scholar official. There's people who move back and forth between these two professions, because when he became tired of dealing with these tribal states in North Africa, that's when he went and sat down and wrote the Muqaddima, and went back into the desert and wrote the Muqaddima.
Well, his concept of Asabiya, which I often translate that as tribal solidarity. Yes. In many ways, his argument is that power essentially is generated by collective identity, and
yes.
And he somehow argues that the natural and the most powerful collective is that which is based on nasab, or relationship, and therefore he privileges tribal identity.
Right.
And, this concept is widely used it has become like a signature concept of Ibn Khaldun and his work. So most people who just read a few pages of Ibn Khaldun will then talk of Asabiya all the time. But what is interesting is that even when you were talking of Asabiya, you were talking about it as some kind of a collective identity. But why don't people see his idea of Asabiya as essentially a pre-modern conception of nationalism?
I think I suppose it could be looked at that way, but of course, since people's identity was more tribal or family oriented at that particular time, I know people have discussed that in the 20th and 21st century, but I don't know why they don't discuss it that way. But as you probably know from reading various commentaries that have been called, people have used his ideas applied his ideas to a number of things in modern times. And I'm not sure that he would have necessarily accepted it as a basis of nationalism. I don't know. It's a complicated question. One thing, of course, that he emphasizes when he's talking about Asabiya is it isn't simply the knowledge of kinship relations. It's also this constant interaction with your kin. And that's a major point that he makes in one section, one particular paragraph. He said, it's true that kinship is important, but if you simply know who your kin are, that isn't enough to generate Asabiya. You have to have this constant interaction, such as these North African tribes had when they were raiding other tribes or raiding the cities, that kind of cooperative interaction. So the question is whether in a national state, particularly a complicated one like the United States, you would have that same kind of cohesion. He talks, for example, when he's about Granada, he said, well, I think he says that Ibn Rushd says that you have a kind of cohesion in the cities, and Ibn Khaldun denies that. He says what you have in the cities are different important families, no doubt, who have their own Asabiya. That is a family, that a relatively small amount of Asabiya confined to the family, but you don't have that kind of cohesion that a tribal group had. So especially when you try to, I think, apply these things to modern times, it's a complicated issue, and one has to take everything that Ibn Khaldun said about it when trying to apply it, I think.
I want to return to this. He does a lot of classification of knowledge also.
Yes. Uh-huh.
I mean, I don't think many people actually read the Tarikh Ibn Khaldun or history of the Kitab al-Ibar. But the book is essentially, some people have described the book, the 4 volumes, as kind of compendium of all knowledge of his time.
Yes. Uh-huh.
That it was like the encyclopedia, everything that people in the Muslim world or the world knew at that time was in his book. So for someone who's advocating the method of philosophy, which requires more of reflection and critical thinking, there was also a lot of information sharing going on.
Yes. He says, you know, at the beginning of the book, he specifically alludes to, first of all, he says, well, that the really good historians could be counted on the fingers of one hand. Right? and then he names al-Masudi, at-Tabari as 2 of these. But in any case, what's interesting about his comment is he refers to what someone like al-Masudi had achieved in his history. And basically then he says that he implies, without explicitly saying this, that he was trying to do the same thing in the Mukaddima. And I'm glad you alluded to this, because I think most people find the text very confusing because of this, because he is trying to do, I think, he's trying to do several things in the Muqaddimah. 1, he's trying to reform historical practice. 2, he's trying to describe how he's trying to apply this to North Africa, to explain how North African politics work. But 3, he's trying to do what you just alluded to. That is to say, he's trying to summarize the knowledge, particularly of the Arab Muslim world, but with a broader framework too. He's trying to summarize all knowledge. So a large part of his book is taken up with describing, for example, the religious knowledge. And so you have, on the one hand, many pages devoted simply to discussion of religion, which has nothing to do with the arguments, the arguments about modernizing the historical practice in the Muqaddimah. And you have other kind of descriptions too, as you know. He'll have long descriptions about the criteria of knowledge, and he lists, for example, all of the Aristotelian philosophical subjects, such as mathematics, physics, music, poetry, and so forth. And so a large part of the book just does contain his compendium of knowledge, which he is consciously doing. It's obvious, it's clear from his introduction, he's consciously doing this, that he's going to do for the 14th century what al-Masudi or Tabari have done earlier.
You know, one of the interesting things that you write in your book about it is how European scholars and philosophers embraced and responded to Ibn Khaldun, especially some of them referring to Ibn Khaldun as a Montesquieu of the Arab world.
Yeah, that's right. It should be reversed, right? The Montesquieu is the Ibn Khaldun of the European world.
Yes, Montesquieu was, and it is also, to me, it's very interesting, is because one of the most prominent scholars of international relations theory, Ken Walls, based one of his most celebrated book on the works of Montesquieu, essentially bringing in the concept of nature. And I think that is one of the things that Ibn Khaldun emphasized more than traditional Muslim scholars, who are more focused on divine knowledge as opposed to empirically trying to deduce what is the nature of things. You know, so in that sense, he was trying to replace a revelation with ontology, studying the nature of things, nature of human beings, nature of human society. So I think he was trying to decipher that and then try to explain the progress of history as a consequence of the nature of human interaction. So I think the idea of the nature was probably, which is a very modern thing, isn't it? So
it is, in terms of you're absolutely right. And what I think seems to be what happens in the 18th and 19th century is you have people like Montesquieu or Adam Smith or Durkheim. These are all people who are philosophically trained. Right? Montesquieu is known to have been educated not only in European Catholicism, but also in Aristotle. And when you read when you particularly read what Montesquieu says about the Roman Empire, you can see that he has the same attitude toward the analysis of a state like the Roman Empire that Ibn Khaldun had about the states in North Africa. And for exactly that reason, that is to say, he's read the same things that Ibn Khaldun had read, right? Yeah. And if you go to Scotland, for example, there are somebody in the late 18th century in this famous intellectual fluorescence, which is referred to as the Scottish Enlightenment. Adam Smith was trained in philosophy for like 5 years at the University of Glasgow. And these people who come out of that tradition, which is also then true of Durkheim, who was trained in philosophy, have read exactly the same things that Ibn Khaldun read. And that is why, of course, they then in this way resurrect the social sciences, or they discovered anew, if you will. It seems to me, that is to say, that Ibn Khaldun, I really believe, is the world's, what he did was he was the pre-modern world's foremost historical scholar in any society because of what he did. And then what you have happening in the 18th and 19th century is the Europeans are essentially rediscovering this approach to the study of human society. Yes. Most of them didn't know about Ibn Khaldun. I mean, a few may have, a few European scholars did, but most of them really didn't. And so you get people like Montesquieu or people like Adam Smith or Durkheim. What they're responding to is having the same kind of education that Ibn Khaldun had.
You know, I want to ask a question about the personal life of Ibn Khaldun. Even though he comes across, because of his cynical approach to the sultanates, he's often clubbed with Machiavelli and Thucydides as a realist scholar. In fact, I just finished a paper with a student of mine on fear, and we were talking about Thomas Hobbes, and we were talking about Ibn Khaldun. So I took Thucydides from the ancient times, Ibn Khaldun from the medieval times, and Hobbes from the modern time to talk about fear. But in his personal life, is it true that he was a practicing Sufi, a mystical guy, which would kind of clash with his philosophical and rational and realistic approach?
You know, this is, as you know, is a major question in discussions of Ibn Khaldun. Of course, so many people that by that period of time were involved in Sufism to one degree or another, as we all know. I mean, there's so many people who had visited Sufis or were involved in Sufism to one degree or another. And people often point to the book he wrote about Sufism, but the book he wrote on Sufism is not a book which emphasizes the importance of acting or worshiping like a Sufi. It's a technical argument in the way Sufism is presented. Certainly when he's in Egypt, for a brief period of time, he's offered the head of a Sufi Khanga in Cairo. And people often point to that as an example that he was a Sufi. Well, what does it mean to be a Sufi? As you know, it's a very complicated issue, because there's so many Persian poets who used Sufi ideology and vocabulary. Were they all practicing Sufis? That is to say, did they, in their daily life, carry on a kind of worship with a Sufi and with a Sufi teacher, with a pir? So I would say that clearly he had some involvement with Sufism, just as almost every person of his education and background would have had some involvement. But what I don't think is true is that the Sufism is what led him to write this, to challenge the historical practice and to write that section of the Mukaddima in which he talks about the emphasis on philosophical, using philosophy to resurrect the historical field. There are some, of course, some similar ideas. There are one particular similar idea to Sufism and what he was doing. That is, he emphasized looking beyond the narrative histories or within or below narrative histories to find out what's really going on. And of course, Sufis talk about doing the same kind of thing spiritually.
He does use the word batin while referring to those things. I mean,
Pardon me?
He does use the word batin while...
He does use it once or twice, but it's not a dominant, it's not in any way a dominant aspect. And of course, he's quite critical of certain aspects of Sufism.
Yes, he is.
So I would say that just the way he, for example, he was a practicing scholar, a legal scholar. And I think his principal identity in terms of his Muslim background is he was a legalist, I think. That's the best way to describe him, I think. Because if you read what he was doing and what he did when he was in Egypt, he was a very devoted, conscious practitioner of Maliki law. And he talks about that more than anything else in his book. When he's talking about his professional interest, he's talking about Maliki law. After all, he doesn't really talk about philosophy beyond his early education and then in the Mukaddima itself. But when he goes from Tunis to Fez to Granada to back to North Africa and to Egypt, when he talks about meeting people, he usually talks about meeting people who are Maliki faqihs, Maliki scholars of one kind or another. So I think when you talk about Sufism or talk about other aspects of his identity, I don't think you can describe him, certainly you can't describe him as a theologian. Yeah. You can't, and I don't think you can describe him as a Sufi in a sense of someone who is practicing, who's a devoutly practicing Sufi in his everyday life, or if he was, he certainly doesn't manifest it in his writings.
You know, if you remember that at the conference that we had attended in Istanbul on Ibn Khaldun, I don't know whether you remember, I came back 2 weeks after that again to Istanbul to speak at another Ibn Khaldun conference.
I know you were there, I saw.
Yeah, and I remember that while I was there, I was visiting some place and I saw posters of another symposium, and I was kind of taken aback that I was not invited to the other one. But I was amazed at how in that 1 month, I think this was November 2000 and probably 15, that there were so many Ibn Khaldun symposiums. So the Turks, I think this is the second attempt by Turkish scholars to revive Ibn Khaldun and reintroduce him to the world at large. So I don't know whether you remember meeting Sayyid Farid al-Attas, who wrote this.
Oh yes, I know him. I've corresponded with him. I know him very well. I like him. I like him very much.
I think Farid is also probably related to Ibn Khaldun. So some of them, like Dr. Rajab Santurk.
They're all from the Yemen, yes.
Yes. So Dr. Rajab Santurk and Farid al-Attas and others who have created this Ibn Khaldun society, they are in a way trying to do what some people from the post-colonial literature call decolonization of knowledge. So they're trying to actually create an alternative social science to what we call as, they're labeling mainstream social science as Western social science and are trying to create an alternative from Ibn Khaldun's. So trying to create an Ibn Khaldunian social science initiative. What do you think of this idea?
Well, I know Farid al-Attas. I like him very much, and I like his work also. I think of the sociologists who write about Ibn Khaldun, he's one of the most sophisticated and insightful people who write, of the sociologists who write about him. I think he's a very impressive individual. And yes, he's from a Hadbi Sayyid family, yes, from the Yemen, and Ibn Khaldun claimed that his ancestors were from the Yemen, and so yes, they may be related. I think that's one thing I actually don't agree to label, to talk about Ibn Khaldun as being being different from Western social sciences, because the reason I don't think that is because the basis of Ibn Khaldun's revisionist of history, that is to try to create a new scientific history, a philosophical history, is essentially the same basis that Europeans use in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. That is, what he does with Greco-Islamic thought, absorbing Greco-Islamic thought, probably especially from Ibn Sina and from Ibn Rushd. But he's taking those ideas and from Greco-Islamic thought, which the Europeans then took from Aristotle and Galen and the other figures who became well known in Europe after they were translated. And so I think it's, I don't want to say it's a waste of time, but I think it's just a mislabeling to say that Ibn Khaldun's social science is different from Western social science that developed in the 18th and 19th century. I guess that's the way I'd put it. I think it's a mislabel to say that they're different, because they're based upon, I think they're based upon essentially the same philosophical ideas and methodologies.
You know, there is a reason why Aristotle is called the first teacher in the Islamic literature. You know, he's the first teacher, and Farabi is the second teacher.
Second teacher, yes.
So I agree with you that I think that one way to describe Ibn Khaldun's work was that his effort to bring Aristotelian logic to understanding history, as opposed to the traditional methods of traditional Muslim scholars who were writing either histories which were like hadith literature, you know, which were just narrations of episodes with a lot of emphasis on the isnad, on the narrators. And so the scientific aspect of that approach to history was more about biographies of those who were part of the chain of narrators. But I think what is amazing is that that some of his ideas today are still extremely powerful and are resonating even today. And that is the important part of it. And rather than trying to, I guess, build a method or science around one individual's ideas, I think what perhaps the best way to do would be to appreciate his work so much. But I have a question about how Ibn Khaldun is taught in Western universities. My daughter, for example, is taking this highly prestigious and competitive program called Directed Studies, which is about philosophy and at Yale. And they do study Hayy ibn Yaqzan, but they don't read Ibn Khaldun in that program. So they are reading Montesquieu, for example, on the agenda. So the question to me is that even though people talk about how Ibn Khaldun was more appreciated in Europe than in the Muslim world, even to this day, you know, he taught at Al-Azhar and he was not taught at Al-Azhar. You know, he was a professor at Al-Azhar University until Muhammad Abdu actually introduced Ibn Khaldun in the 20th century. Al-Azhar scholars never read Ibn Khaldun's work, at least as part of the curriculum.
Yes, that's right.
Is Ibn Khaldun well taught, shall we say, in Western universities today?
No, I totally agree with you. What's remarkable about this is if you read books on historiography written in Europe, that Ibn Khaldun is never included, almost never included. He's known to a few people. He's known to some sociologists. That's what he taught. He's known to a few people who deal in philosophy, but in terms of a general knowledge in people who study historiography or study Islamic thought, he's hardly known at all. And I think I think it's just remarkable. I still don't quite understand why this is the case. That he is not integrated into the larger world of intellectual world, if you say it, the people in the West, even though he belongs in it. I mean, intellectually, he belongs in that world and should be included and integrated into it. So generally speaking, in courses in Islamic, courses that I had, I should say that when I was taking courses in Islamic and Middle Eastern history at Berkeley, that John Masson Smith, who taught Iranian history of Iran, medieval Iran, and so forth, did include Ibn Khaldun as part of the curriculum, mainly is to talk about tribal groups in the Middle East. This is the whole argument about Asabiya and so forth. So I was introduced to Ibn Khaldun. In fact, my first seminar at Berkeley. But I think beyond that, I guess your daughter's experience demonstrates, that he's hardly known or appreciated at all, much more in Turkey, where, of course, his works were translated into Turkish at a very early period. And intellectually, I mean, Ibn Khaldun is known in a far wider range intellectually in Turkey than any, as I'm sure you know. than any other place. So, but it's remarkable how little, considering his importance and intellectual stature. I mean, and one has to say, I mean, it was simply a brilliant and totally original work in the Mukaddima, what he did. It's extraordinary.
When I teach him in undergraduate classes, when I introduce Ibn Khaldun, I always play this. There's a 30-second clip of Ronald Reagan talking.
Yes.
If you remember, Ronald Reagan talks about Ibn Khaldun and says, when I was in college, I read about this Arab philosopher called Ibn Khaldun, and he goes on to say, he talks about Ibn Khaldun's critique of tax policy. And so it was very interesting to me that I don't know where Reagan went to school, but he did study Ibn Khaldun.
Somebody told him about, also recently, I mean, Paul Krugman, the New York Times one time referred, Mark Zuckerberg refers. So he does have a kind of status, and people somehow kind of stumble or are told about him. And what I find is that some people, simply the fact of citing Ibn Khaldun is something to suggest a kind of intellectual sophistication.
Yes, that's right. But,
even if they don't really understand what's going on in the Mukaddima, nonetheless, the cite Ibn Khaldun shows that you have a kind of intellectual sophistication in the Islamic world.
But the good news is that both my undergraduates and graduates are at least introduced to Ibn Khaldun. I recently wrote a book on Ihsan, and I will be sending you a copy of it, in which I did discuss Ibn Khaldun's, but mostly his political theory rather than his history. So Professor Dale, thank you very much for talking to me, and it was not just intellectually stimulating, but it was also joyous for me to be able to talk. There are not many people that we can talk about Ibn Khaldun and his work, but I want to thank you for doing such a brilliant job of writing this book, and I can see from the way you wrote that it meant a lot to you also. I mean, I could sense that this was something that you really enjoyed doing. So thank you very much, and thank you for talking to me.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's really been a pleasure.
Well, let me just stop recording it.